And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Chuck Wexler here from PERF in Washington. And if I never hear the word virtual again, I will be very happy. I hope this is the last virtual thing I ever do in my life. I know the technology is going to work most of the time, but some of the time something's going to happen. I don't know what it is, but just be prepared. Anyhow, seriously, great to be here. We have a great session today, 2 hours. I want to tell you that you can submit questions by clicking in the chat icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You can submit questions at any time. There's two other words I don't want to hear anymore: chat and icon. I don't want to hear them anymore after the pandemic. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Central Square. This takes funding to do this, and Central Square has been great. Here's a message from Tim Boyle, the Chief Transformation Officer.
Hi, my name is Tim Boyle, Chief Transformation Officer for Central Square. I wanted to say how honored we are at Central Square to sponsor PERF's 2021 Town Hall meeting. The men and women at Central Square are committed to creating safer, smarter, and more connected communities. For us to be successful in reaching our goal, we are committed to support the men and women in law enforcement, and organizations like PERF have developed today's agenda of some of the most relevant and timely issues facing our nation. Thank you for letting us be a part of your town hall.
And thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Central Square. Much appreciated. I want to welcome Mike Harrison, the Baltimore Police Commissioner and the President of PERF. Commissioner, great to see you. Would you like to say some welcoming remarks, sir?
Yeah, thank you, and good to see you, Chuck. Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. We're certainly thrilled and happy that all of you can be with us today for our town hall. Certainly our profession is facing challenges to the likes we've never seen before. Many of us, if not most of us, are seeing rising violent crime. Some of us are seeing spiking, very high spikes in violent crime, while at the same time, we're hearing for calls for reform. And some of those calls are to the extreme of dismantle and defund, while all at the same time, we are sworn to protect and serve the people who entrust this to us. And so we're happy to talk today and to learn from each other about all the issues that we're facing and how we're going to overcome these issues together. So once again, thank you for joining us. We look forward to a great town hall.
And thanks, Commissioner, from Baltimore. We're going to focus the first session on violent crime. It is for police chiefs around the country. It is the number one issue. And today we have four individuals I'd like to introduce. NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea from New York. Commissioner, how are you, sir?
Chuck, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, and it's great to see some of my people that are in the trenches with us. Erica, how are you?
And that is Erica Shields from Louisville. Chief, can you say hello?
Hi, it's great being here. Thank you for having me. And Dermot, your makeup is spotless.
Oh, thank Erica. I was in the bathroom for at least a half an hour with it. It's a full day's job for me. Okay, and from Portland, Chief Chuck Lavelle. Chief?
Hi, Chuck. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here with you today. And I want to apologize in advance. We have a city rule here in Portland that requires me to wear my mask in the office still. So,
well, it's a good thing in Portland you don't have many rules. You can just do what you want, right, Chief?
Exactly.
Okay, and right here in the PERF studio with me is Murphy Paul from Baton Rouge. I'm from Boston, and we would think Murphy Paul, he should be Paul Murphy, but he's Murphy Paul. Being from Boston, this is our kind of humor. Nice to have you, Chief. How's it going from Baton Rouge?
It's going well. Some challenges, but a look forward to the conversations today. I see my NEI buddy over there running things in New York. Good to see you. And I'm excited.
Okay. All right. Well, he's here with me right here in DC. Let's start out with you, Dermot. You grew up in the NYPD. You've been there during a whole series of times when things back in the 90s and then the changes that came about, and then through the periods when you headed the department's CompStat program, and you were very, you talked about pinpoint policing. But now I'm going to tell you numbers that you already know, but I think people need to know how things have happened, have evolved. In homicide, there was a 47% increase from 319 to 468 between 2019 and 2020. But the shooting victims, that doubled, 102% increase, and homicides, have gone up. Shootings have gone up. This is not the NYPD that you know, and something's different. And by the way, what I'm saying about New York, I'm going to say about Portland, I'm going to say about Baton Rouge, I'm going to say about Louisville. This is not New York. This is nationally. In your mind, when you look at the numbers, when you look at who's shooting who last year and this year, give us some sense behind the numbers. You're so good at this. You study this, you know this stuff. Give us a sense of what's driving it, but more importantly, who are the victims and who are the suspects?
Thanks, Chuck. I could talk for hours on this, and I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible. You're right. We've had a real challenging period of time here in New York City for the last year and a half. The crime increase that we saw here, and each city is different, although I do think as an outsider, I think there's some similarities that I'll reference in a moment, and I'm interested to hear what some of the other chiefs say. But our crime increase started at the beginning of 2020, before COVID, before what we went through with the murder of George Floyd. What makes it very difficult right now, I think, is that there is still a political element to this, where people are kind of dug in with their heels and not coming to the middle enough, my opinion. And now you have a situation, Chuck, where there are a number of factors influencing what's going on, from defunding the police to passing laws that certainly restrict the police at times, whether you agree with them or not. It's certainly a difficult time here in New York City to get charges against someone to result in somebody being incarcerated. And that last point there, Chuck, I think is the common denominator, at least what I hear when I go to major city chiefs and when I speak to some of my coworkers across the country. While bail reform is coined here in New York because there was a drastic change to our laws from 2019 heading into 2020, and we saw it immediately. But then you hear, well, crime is going up all over the country, so that couldn't be what it is in New York. Well, not so fast, because I think as you talk to chiefs around the country, what I hear is the common denominator of a softening of laws and a reaction to a historical over-incarceration, but moving that pendulum awfully fast in another direction. And I try to, whenever I have a microphone, talk about we got to get to the middle, where we don't have to choose between high crime or doing it the right way. We can have low crime and police the right way, but we got to work together to get to that middle ground. We had already proven in New York that you could, and that's only 18 months ago. But right now, I think many cities in the country are seeing a movement to decarcerate. And at the end of the day, I know here, many of the issues that we're seeing are pointing to that. Now, you could talk also about the courts, Chuck. I was on the TV this morning talking about the courts. I said last year here in New York, the courts being shut down is killing us. I immediately got some pushback that said, no, the courts are open. Well, the courts were never open. What they did was they kept arraignments open, but as soon as somebody was arraigned, they went right back onto the street. And there really was no grand juries at the time. Hence, there was no trials. And if there's no grand juries and no trials, no defense attorney in their right mind would ever tell a defendant to take a plea that's going to result in incarceration. If they did, they probably should be disbarred. And as we move now a year into that, it's gotten a little better. Grand juries have started. We've even had some trials here in New York, although not all parts of New York City. But overwhelmingly, it is still a waiting game where we now have a backlog of 5,000 gun arrests waiting to move through the system and for justice to be served. Some of them should result in jail time. Some of them probably should be pled down. There's a lot of different variables in there. But what's happening is none of them are going to jail right now. And it's creating an environment, Chuck, when you pull all this together, 20% reduction in the state prisons in 1 year, 20% reduction in the New York City jails last year in 1 month. Chuck, think about for a second, you take the jails and 20% of the population just walks out the door. Where are the safety nets? Where are the programs to make sure? Where is the housing? None of this was done adequately, in my opinion. And then think about all the historical beefs between gangs and turf that had to be settled. That's our life for the last 18 months, and that's what we're trying to get our arms around right now.
Dermot, let me ask you a question, because this is sort of a question a lot of people are asking, and for some reason it's just not getting out. Who are the victims, right? Let's look at the equation. Who are the victims, right? Shootings are going up, homicides are going up. You know, New York. So everything you said, I take, that's right. But I say to you, at the end of the day, who are the people that are being victimized? What do they look like? Where do they live?
Yeah, we see some constants, Chuck. They tend to be people of color. When you look at our victims of violent crime, particularly shootings, it tends to be about anywhere from 95 to 97% African American and Hispanic. That's what the numbers generally are in New York, and that's holding true now. It's concentrated. It's concentrated in some of the poorer neighborhoods. When you look at the data here in New York City, generally speaking, about 40 to 50% of our shootings take place in 10 precincts, and we have 77 precincts to give you some scale. So it's really zeroed in on some of the tougher neighborhoods in New York City, some of the neighborhoods where on the ground what you hear is the opposite of defund. We want more cops, but that's not always what's portrayed in the evening news or what you see in some of these debates. And one last thing, Chuck, disturbing a little trend within the shooting victims, younger. We're starting to see some younger victims, which is really alarming. And we had a 10-year-old boy shot and killed about 2 weeks ago. He was buried yesterday. Last summer, we had a 1-year-old shot in a stroller. Those horror stories are real life people, real life victims. And, it just creates an environment where, you hear about trauma. This is real trauma. A shooting is affecting the entire family. It's affecting really everyone on the block. And for every shooting, you have incidents of shots being fired. And it's just as frightening, I would argue, for the people that live in that community.
Let me just ask you one question. I'm going to go on to the others, but then I want to come back again for a group discussion. Motivation, okay? What is the 3 or 4 reasons that people are shooting each other? If you had to put them in categories, what would they be? The 4 top categories that's driving these shootings.
I'm just going to give you 2 because that makes up probably close to 90% of our shootings. Gangs. Gangs are going to make up, it's a soft number, Chuck. What we know definitively is we can point to facts and say 50% of our shootings are gang related. But that's with knowing only about half of the stories too. So in shootings where somebody is uncooperative or doesn't want to tell us why they were shot at, or where we have an innocent bystander hit and we don't know who the real intended target was and things of that nature, that gang number is going to grow dramatically. Gangs make up easily, you can ballpark it, about 75% of the shootings here, give or take 5%. And then drugs, historical drug disputes, whether it's traditional drugs or marijuana, even though it's legalized, there's an awful lot of money at stake in turf. That is what drives the shootings here in New York City. And the gang ones, there's an overlap. Sometimes the gang shootings are drugs. Sometimes it's these young kids that are literally, Chuck, as we know, this is a phenomenon across the country, but they're fighting over literally nothing. So gangs and drugs, and if we get our arms around that and the availability of guns, that's our major problem.
All right, Dermot, stand by. Let me bring the other three on, then we'll have a group discussion. Let's go to Portland. Chuck, I'm looking at the numbers similar, to New York, smaller in size, but similar increase, 63% increase from 35 to 57 homicides. Shooting incidents, this is 129% increase, 389 to 891. These are real people, individuals. So, Chief, you just heard Commissioner Shea talking about New York. Tell us about Portland. Now, I don't think about Portland as a particularly, violent city. And you grew up in the department. This has to be difficult for you. And I know they dismantled your gun team that you had working on it. But let's talk about what's driving it, and let's talk about who the victims are.
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. And I think we're seeing a lot of the same things as Dermot's talking about in New York. It's alarming rises in violence, particularly shootings here. Year to date, we're at approximately 525 shootings. But if you look back from June of last year to June of this year, that number is a lot greater. And, from what we know, it's hard to characterize in total, but I'll tell you about half of our shooting victims are Black. And, Portland has a pretty small African-American or Black population. We're talking about 6%. So that's an alarming number. And we're talking about Black males between 18 and 35 as far as victims go. And of the suspects, the known suspects, about 40% of those are Black males also. So this rise in violence is having an outsized impact on our Black community here in Portland.
And then, in terms of motivation, Chief, what do you think's driving it? I mean, as I say, Portland, you don't usually have more than 10, 15 homicides a year, if I'm not mistaken. What's driving it? What's the motivation? Is it the pandemic? Now, New York says they've got the criminal justice system. Portland, you've got all sorts of things going on there with the criminal justice system too. You have a district attorney, different philosophies and so forth. Tell us about, number one, what's the motivation? And number two, what do you think's driving all of this?
Yeah, I would throw them in a few different buckets. I think just spontaneous conflicts, road rages or disputes, things that otherwise may have previously been a fight or something like that are now erupting into gunfire. Rivalries. We do have gang issues here in Portland, Oregon as well. Domestic violence, I think, is one that we need to pay attention to also. Some of our shootings are domestic related, inter-family type things. And, it's hard to say the pandemic plays a role because I don't have any data per se, but I do think that, people are not in their normal routine. Maybe they're out at places other than work or where they would normally be, or maybe they're at home with some family member or someone that maybe they're not used to being around, and that may contribute to some of it. But I don't have any real COVID-19 data. That's just anecdotal. But I think, there's a lot of firearms on the streets as well. And one of the troubling things here is typically we wouldn't have shootings in our homeless encampments, but we've had a few of those this year. Typically, those would be fights or stabbings, but very rarely do you get shootings in these homeless encampments. And that's something that we've seen take place this year in Portland.
When you look at the victims and the suspects, what are the backgrounds in terms of, have they been through the criminal justice system before? How many times, when you do have suspects, what do they look like?
It depends. I think, for us, we do have some, particularly ones that have a gang affiliation or nexus, that do have criminal justice involvement in the past. But we've had some just innocent victims shot here too that really had no gang affiliation or no real criminal history to speak of. So I think it varies. It's hard to say when you have so many rounds being fired in your city. You have the potential for people to be innocent bystanders and get caught up in gunfire. And I think for us, it's really trying to do the best we can do as far as public safety. With the numbers of officers we have, that number's dwindled quite a bit. So we're down, I think, 129 officers since July 1 of last year. And with that resource, we don't have necessarily the numbers to do those sorts of things. And then also trying to be responsive to what the community's telling us about reform and what we're hearing they expect from their police. So it's really trying to marry those two things as best we can, but still keep people safe at the same time.
And on top of that, you have had demonstrations you had like 100 days of demonstrations in a row, right? I mean, it was, while your violent crimes going up, you had literally, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, was it 100 straight days of demonstrations in Portland?
We ran our incident management team for crowd control for 170 straight days.
Meaning, what does that mean? What did that entail? What kind of resources did that entail?
It would depend on the night, but on nights where we did experience large crowds or violent crowds, we would have to pull officers from their precinct call answering duties to respond to downtown or other locations to engage in crowd management. And then that depletes your call taking precinct resources. So there are less officers out on the street doing patrol and things of that nature while they're downtown doing crowd control. And then if you have a shooting or something of that nature, you don't have necessarily the resources to respond to that, to do your crime scene, do your initial follow-up investigation. If you have maybe a suspect or a car, you have very little officer power to go out and try to follow up on those leads immediately. So I think that pull from the patrol function to crowd control was very, very tough for our city.
Okay, thanks, Chief. Let's go to Louisville and Chief Erica Shields. Okay, Erica, how are you? I'm looking at your homicide numbers from 2019 to 2020. You had a 92% increase from 90 homicides to 173. And then from 2020 to 2021, a 71% increase. That's just through April. I'm sure you have more accurate numbers, 34 to 58. And I only point this out so nobody feels alone here. This is not one city. This is a national surge we have coming. Can you talk to us a little bit? Now, you come from Atlanta. You come into Louisville as a new chief. And so, you've had experience in Atlanta, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But let's focus on Louisville. What do you think? What are you seeing when you talk to your people? What's driving the numbers in Louisville? Maybe similar to what you heard or different? And then what do suspects and victims look like, and what are motivations?
I think that everything that Dermot said, I could cut and paste. I mean, everything he said applied, so I won't go over that again. The only two things that I would layer on top of his comments were the staffing here is extremely dire, and it's the South, so you have the non-existent gun laws. And so similar to what I ran into in Georgia, that when anyone can have a gun, they tend to. And it just lends itself for more illegal guns being on the street. And so it makes them much more readily available. But other than that, I could really just parrot everything he said. Our victims here are 80% of them approximately are African American, 85% of them are male. Clearly, it is the poor Black neighborhood that is taking the brunt of this violence, unfortunately.
And just in terms of what's driving it, is it gangs? Is it drugs? Is it, some people have talked about some kind of, during the pandemic, people have less patience. Is it domestic violence? See if you can, is it, when you put your finger on that dramatic increase, is it, what do you think is pushing people to this?
I think it's a really unfortunate confluence of events. I think the city, the department was already on a slide a good 6 months prior to Breonna Taylor's tragic death. The department had several high-profile traffic stops that it appeared that they were either racially profiling or that they just were using extremely poor decision making. As a result, a decision was made in July, I believe, 2019, that basically what was messaged to the officers is don't. Traffic policy was rewritten in a very convoluted manner, in my opinion. And the messaging done broadly to the public was, we aren't doing traffic. Well, what you see is that at this time, the self-initiated production by the officers is a straight line south, and crime goes straight north. And I agree, going back to what Dermot said, is we have to understand that it is all right for police to police. It's all right for them to do traffic stops. We just have to do it the correct way. So that really jump-started what you saw here is the violence going up. It started to steady off in like January, February of 2020. It probably helps that they get a mild winter here. They get some snow and such. But then when Breonna Taylor occurred and went public I think went public in May with everything else, what you saw is the productivity, again, self-initiation came to a screeching halt and the crime went straight north on an upward trajectory. So it's a little nuanced here. I think like everyone else, you're dealing with COVID, you're dealing with lax gun laws, you're dealing with folks who have nothing, no opportunity. You're dealing with guns in the hands of young folks who have no conflict resolution skills. You're dealing with desperation. So if you take all of these factors that my colleagues have touched on, and then you throw in there a surplus of guns, I don't think it's necessarily shocking that we're here. And then for Louisville and LMPD, add into that the fact that police work, proactive police work, has stopped in 2019 and really has not resumed as of yet.
Well, you just touched on, what some people might call the elephant in the room, but you're being honest and you're talking about proactive police activity, and you're talking about a police force that has come under a lot of scrutiny, good, bad, or indifferent, and you're basically being honest, and you're saying, and forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, you'll correct me, that the cops are nervous, not nervous, afraid of anybody, but afraid of the consequences of doing something well-intentioned, but it doesn't go right. Maybe that's not the right way. You put it in your own words, but that's the big elephant in the room, at least to some degree, would you say?
Oh, 1,000%. So when I came here, I really made an effort to reassure the officers that give them guidance on how to do the job, what have you. But the reality of it is what they've experienced, what they're seeing nationally with the arrival of the DOJ. The reality of it is, to be honest with you, and I can't, the problem the space that I've been in is I came in cautious because I knew how to fight violent crime. I'd always gotten violent crime down. And so there was a part of me when I got here that I wanted to just hammer it and go after it. But I knew that the city could not handle another incident of any sort. It was just in the position, it was just that precarious. And so I really just have been trying to build time and navigate this slowly. We're at a point now, I realize, honestly, it would be easier for me to do nothing. If we don't have another protest, I will be viewed as successful. But that's not me, and I know it's not my fellow chiefs. When we're looking at this violent crime and we're cleaning up dead people from the street, many of them are children, it's enough. And so my posture is, no, I need us to be reengaged. I need us to be proactive. So literally, I've been doing Zoom calls today. I've run back to the house to let the chimney man on the chimney because everything in Louisville is older. And I'm putting on my uniform later, and my executive command team and I are going patrolling. We are running details tonight, policing. And I intend to do that a couple times a week until I can get a cadence, at least in the areas that are getting decimated by violence, for the officers to have a level of comfort. I'm not going to stand by and just watch people to be shot dead. It's not who we are. And that's the space, unfortunately, we have been pushed into. Listen, I'll be the first to say, we have shot ourselves in the foot. We employ human beings. There is racism in policing. But at the end of the day, we have to do something. And I really, really hope that the rest of the judicial system gets off their asses and helps us. I mean, I'd be shocked if anyone here, when they look at the people who are committing the violent crime, if they're finding people who are first-time offenders. And it's like, no, come on, let's get our arms around this together. I'm all for these other programs to keep people out of the system, to redirect them. I'm all in on that. I will do that all day long. But the reality of it is, you do have people who have no desire other than do anything but shoot guns and kill people. And how is that okay that we're allowing that to happen? Is it because 80% of my victims are Black? Certainly. If 80% of my victims were white, we would not be having this town hall.
Can I let me thank you for what you just said. It feels like you're carrying this on your shoulders, but yet you just finished telling me that this is happening in some of the most impoverished neighborhoods of Louisville. I mean, listen, I admire you for carrying this on your shoulders, but shouldn't this be carried on other people's shoulders as well? I mean, this is where this is this fine line between getting the community involved and the community feeling as though they're being, stigmatized in some way. How is the reaction within the city of Louisville in those areas? What do they expect of the police? How do they I know from talking to a lot of chiefs that people living in those communities are the ones that mostly, they want good constitutional policing, but they want to see the police. How does the community find a role for itself in this conversation?
I think, to be fair, it's a little different. So, in Atlanta, the majority of the population and the majority of the police department were African American. So it was much, in my sense, it was easier to get things done because you had that momentum and you had that energy. I've come into Louisville where there has not been the appropriate attention on hiring Black people, period. Shame on LMPD. It would not be honest to say that it's just Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was the tipping point. DOJ is here, and it's not because of one incident. And so there is a level of distrust in the Black community that is completely understandable. Do I think it is because police, by and large, were targeting them and don't like Black people? No, I think it was poor policing and poor supervision. What a lot of us saw maybe in the mid-90s, early 2000s, when we were so numerically driven in our arrests. So you definitely do hear from the community that they want to be able to sit on their porch and not be murdered, right? They want to be able to walk outside and not be shot at. But there is also there is not a comfort or a confidence in the police department that where it's not where it should be, and that's on the police department. And the difficulty is, in a perfect world, you take the community policing officers, you put them out there, and that really does make a difference. We did in Atlanta, it makes a huge difference. The problem is I don't have people. I have nobody. And so we are engaging, it's getting the council people from those areas to be our messengers. It's connecting with the religious community. But more than anything, and I say this all day long, it's going to have to be repeated performances of LMPD performing properly. I can give speeches, talk, meet and greets all day long, but until we start showing that we know how to do the job and we know how to do it in a manner it should be done, constitutionally correct, there is going to be an enormous amount of doubt in the Black community, and I get it.
So what I hear you saying is you're in a rebuilding phase right now, but while you're doing that, you're going to lead by example. You're going to be out there, you're going to be motivating people, you're going to do what you can with what you got now, but you're recognizing this is going to take some time to rebuild the relationships, both in the community and in your own police department too. You have a double-edged sword. You've got police officers that are looking to you. You've got the community that's looking to you. Sometimes it's a zero-sum game where you make one faction happy and one faction unhappy, isn't it?
It is, absolutely is. And I think that's what I've been navigating with the commanders is it is easier to take the back seat. Because if you're doing nothing, it's okay, it's at least you're not opening yourself up to that level of criticism if something goes controversial. And I don't mean doing nothing literally, but I think we know what I mean. But the reality of it is, we got in this profession because we believe in taking care of people and doing things correctly. And what I do need to put in here is a caveat, and I mean this sincerely. When I came in here, I fully expected the officers to not want to work, just because of the landscape and what we all saw and went through in the last year. And I was pleasantly surprised and continue to be. These folks want to work. These officers want to work. They want the community, Black and white, to be proud of them. They want to enjoy their job again, but they don't have the confidence to step forward because they're so concerned, and understandably, that they are going to be hung out publicly to dry. And, we're in an area where these folks, protesters will show up at the officer's house. It's one thing, if it's as a chief, you kind of take on that ugliness. But when you're a rank and file cop, that's not what you want your young wife or husband seeing and kids. So there's it's a difficult space, but there are very good officers here.
All right. Now, right here, right next to me is Chief Murphy Paul from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chief, similar issues around the country. Homicides, 47% increase, 69 to 101. And then through 2021, a 60% increase in homicides. So, Chief, tell me, you've been listening to our other three speakers.
Yes, sir.
How big is Baton Rouge?
The same thing. We have around 240,000 residents in our city. And we're experiencing the same thing. Listening to the other chiefs, it's the same issues. When it comes to violent crime in our city.
So give me your sense. When I talked to you on the phone, you talked about, things that bothering people more so now. You actually had some thoughts about, what might be driving the shootings and the homicides. And Baton Rouge, right?
Yes, sir. It's the groups. It's feuds. It's young areas in the city, disinvested communities, where we're starting to see multiple incidents where this is being played out on social media. We actually have social media where we have groups of young men who identify as rappers that are disrespecting each other on social media. They're threatening each other on social media. And today's suspect is tomorrow's victim, and today's victim is tomorrow's suspect. And what I hear from my officers every day, when we have our weekly meetings as chief, we're dealing with the same individuals over and over and over again. And when you have young men who are involved in this violent lifestyle, and they continue their felonious activity, and they go to jail and they get out and there's a bond, and then they commit another crime and they get out and there's another bond and they get out. What happens is the community sees that. That interferes in community police relations because now there's a fear, even more so, to help cooperate, because those persons who are the shooters are the ones that are getting out, and they're developing reputation. And we're starting to see this block in areas where we saw some wins in building community police
But what
relations.
is different? If it's the same individuals happening, what is different about this period? What variable is interfering, right? People are saying it's, same people,
Right.
they have backgrounds. Like you heard Dermot Shea talk about the criminal justice system having an impact. You're in Baton Rouge. How do you think, what other variables are there that's driving it? Or you heard Erica Shields talk about elephant in the room, police being less likely to engage, proactive policing. What is different?
I think it's
What's
a combination of all of those. But let's talk about Baton Rouge. One of the things I see, we just had a shooting incident where 6 people were shot in a parking lot at a club. We had police officers in the parking lot. But police officers in the parking lot who immediately began to administer first aid and CPR on those who were injured. 2 died. Those young men knew law enforcement was right there and continued because there was an argument or some beef and they didn't have those conflict resolution skills to resolve that. When we are starting to deal with a young group of individuals that walk up to a pool party a couple of weeks before that, there was no mask, it was daytime, and shot and killed 3 individuals. One was a 1-year-old child, and then gradually walk away. There is not a fear for the criminal justice system. And when we talk to victims, when we talk to these young men, and we it's this attitude of that's how it is in Baton Rouge. It is what it is. So there's no hope for some of these young men. They don't care if they live or die. And that's that group that we're dealing with right now. And it's young black men. Over 85% of my victims are young black men. And those when we can identify a suspect is black men killing young black men in the city of Baton Rouge.
But your community, if you're saying 85%
Yep.
of the victims are blacks, the community is, those families are being hit hard. What do the families, what does the community expect of you? The national perspective is mass incarceration and, the need for police reform. We don't disagree with any of that. But at the same time, you've got a serious, forgive me, epidemic of violence that's impacting your community in ways, so what does the community expect you to do?
So what we're doing, and look, the community, just like there's the community wants us there, right? They want a police presence. They want the crime down more than they live it every day. They live in those communities. But one of the things that we're seeing is in all of these homicides and what we are asking, look, there are opportunities for intervention prior to a lot of these shooting incidents. We're seeing it on social media. We know that there are individuals in that person's inner circle, family member, loved ones, girlfriends, relatives, neighbors, those who may either hear the threats on social media or that person has communicated it. But nobody picks up the phone and call law enforcement. So what we're doing now is we're going to family members. We have our violence interventionists that are going there, training them how to de-escalate beefs in these neighborhoods, in these targeted areas. We're pushing out data to those who provide services where we're seeing specific type of issues, hoping to get out in front of it from preventing crime from happening. But we're asking the community to do your part and prevent these shootings from happening, because when you don't, look at the end result.
Do you think some part of the narrative in terms of the tragedy with George Floyd has impacted the trust of the community in your department, and that's why the community is more reluctant to give information or to work, or maybe that isn't the case?
No, look, we had challenges prior to that. I mean, we were coming off the heels of the Alton Sterling in custody death. We know that there was a lot of barriers in community police relations, and we began to work on it. I believe when George Floyd happened, we didn't have civil unrest in Baton Rouge. And I think in part is because that healing had already began. We already started listening sessions. We began to acknowledge our role that we played. We began to train our officers a little different. So I think because the healing had already started, that's why we didn't see it. But it also agitated scores, right? And we had to go back and have these conversations again. Social media has made the world so small. It doesn't matter if it happens in any one of our community, it makes its way on our front door. And every police officer who sees it asks himself or herself, what would my chief do? What would my community do? That does impact morale.
Okay, let's do this. Let's bring all of our chiefs up if we can. Okay, so you've all had the benefit of listening. It sounds to me, these stories sound very similar, and yet they're 4 different parts of the country. I'm going to go back real quickly to Dermot Shea, and I think, what do we have, about 10 minutes left in this segment? Do we have how much time?
Correct.
10 minutes, okay. I'm just curious. What I want to do here is, since you've all now had the benefit of listening to each other, I want to give you each a couple of minutes to kind of respond to the conversation. I'm going to start with Commissioner Shea in New York.
Thanks, Chuck. As I listened to everyone speaking, it's interesting. I think I was probably mostly accurate in terms of there's a lot of similarities in terms of what we're seeing across the country. Some of my, fellow chiefs said it probably a little more eloquently than I did, but we are seeing exactly the same thing. Erica talks about the criminal justice system, and you just heard the same from Baton Rouge. When you think back, Chuck, I thought of this recently. When you think back to President Obama and Chuck Ramsey and the task force on policing that was, brought together a number of years ago. I think a piece of that also dealt with looking at the criminal justice system as a whole. And I know that Major City Chiefs and, has been kind of hot on this issue of recently. I think there's an opportunity here, because I think if you let us talk and talk and talk, as dire as some of these statistics are, and the passion that you hear from each of the chiefs about how we're not going to stop and how we're going to move forward and how we're going to rally the cops around. And my cops are the same. They're out there working. I think the elephant applies in New York as well, but that doesn't mean they stopped working. But there's also an awful lot of good that's being done, and working with communities in ways that I never would have imagined 30 years ago. Everything from food drives to mentoring to trying to get kids jobs. I mean, and I know that New York is not alone on this. We're doing probably the same things, because everyone on this call does talk. But I don't know for the life of me why, when we talk about crime, we are still really segmenting, and we go right to the police, and we miss the point here. And where we can really make the gains is when we look at the criminal justice system as a whole, my opinion. And we don't want mass incarceration, but we need data. And it seems like the data and the transparency kind of stops at the door of the police and doesn't extend to prosecutors, to programs, to diversion, to drug treatment courts. And let's have those hard conversations about probation, parole, what works, what do we need to copy either in New York City or Atlanta or Louisville or Baton Rouge or Portland or anywhere else in this country, and what really doesn't work, and there's no data to protect it. And when we get to that point, Chuck, I think we're going to be getting closer to a real good place where we can keep crime down. We can do it with probably less cops, my opinion. We can do it being able to divert more money out of police and into programs, because I don't think anyone on this call would be against that. I don't think it's all police. It has to be police with the foundation, but it also has to be investing in communities, whether it's schools, programs, arts, and everything else. But when we're having the same conversation for my 30 years. Crime is up, all right, send the police in. What works, what doesn't work? Put too many people in jail, put not enough people in jail without really coming together. And it seems to me it's an awful shame that we had a commission. We had the best leaders in this country really study this. It was under the auspices of the White House, and I just don't see what really came of that.
Let me ask you, Dermot, a question before I go on to the others. I know we have DOJ waiting here, but you've been studying, this for a long time. You're really a student of the numbers in New York. Do you think that what we're seeing last year and this year is kind of a statistical aberration, or do you think we're looking at a change for the next 5 years? Do you see what does your what instincts tell you?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chuck. I mean, nothing is alone here, so there's a lot of different variables, and we are one piece. But I am worried. I'll tell you, Chuck. I told the New York media last year, and this is before we ever heard of George Floyd, that we had a problem coming when COVID was over. There is going to be a crime problem. And we knew it because you know how well we know crime here in New York City. We have to get that balance back. The balance has been lost, Chuck. There are a lot of different pieces. Listen, if schools suddenly start outperforming exponentially, that'll help. If there's money diverted to programs, that'll help. If people suddenly start getting better jobs, and there's a lot of factors here, but in our world, in our narrow world, something has to change in terms. You cannot take 20% of the prison population and 20% of the jail population in a very short period of time and throw them out into the system. And Chuck, let's talk facts here and let's dispel with the myths. There was too many people in jail at one point in time, but you know as well as I do that we had cut incarceration in New York State and New York City to the lowest levels in years. Maybe not enough, maybe too far, but we had cut it so far and cut crime down and introduced neighborhood policing. And it was just turned upside down overnight. Right now, there is zero consequences. We just arrested somebody recently. It was his 5th gun incident in 2 years. There are zero consequences, and we got to get some of that balance back. Otherwise, it's going to take longer more than shorter to get this turned around.
All right, thanks, Commissioner. Erica Shields, and then Chuck, and then Murphy. I've got if you could each take just about a minute to 2 minutes, because I've got the DOJ people hanging in here. So this is so important. I could talk another hour on this, but I apologize. Erica, back to you. You're on mute, Erica. Erica, you're on mute. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm like Dermot in this. I think the part that I'm really struggling with is I don't see a finish date. And it's different. It's different because we know some of the solutions, and we're not doing anything. And so it's like, why would we expect this to end or a different outcome? And also further, what causes me angst is, to me, what's unique now is the profession is so unappealing. I've been in policing a little over 25 years, and I don't ever remember it being so unappealing to new hires. By that I mean. And so I agree. Most agencies can cut back. I think with services we can figure out ways to scale down, certainly. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about the proliferation of illegal guns in the street, that cannot be handled by caseworkers. And you have to have a certain number of cops to do all of these things and these programs that you're talking about. And I don't see that there's that interest in people wanting to police. And we all know you can't just go hire someone and have them ready rapidly. So I have real heartburn over the future of policing for that reason. And Dermot hit it head on. I did an interview with my homicide commander last week. We tried to do a podcast because we've really struggled with the media here. And my question to him was, what are you seeing on these homicides? What's the primary driver? And his point was, there's no consequences. And I just had a man shot and killed on his porch by a 14 and 11-year-old. And it's just because there's no consequences. And I don't want these kids in jail. And I think for all of us, the hardest part where you really, as a cop and as a chief, you can start predicting who's going to die. You can see the trajectory, and it's young kids, and you can see all these places where things could change if someone stepped in. But when we have nothing, and why would we expect a different outcome? And I don't mean that to be negative, but I'm a big believer in competing and improving. And I sense such a level of politicalization that we actually have pushed ourselves into a space of apathy. And I find that very troubling. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Chief Lovell, real quickly in Portland, and I'm going to end and then move to DOJ. Chief, from
Sure.
Portland.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. I agree with everything that's been said thus far. One of the things that really strikes me is, we're in this time where we're really focused on change and having a positive impact on some racial disparities, but those disparities exist everywhere. We're talking education, healthcare, criminal justice system. And I think if we're going to really move the needle and do things that are impactful for society as a whole, I think we're solely focused on law enforcement at the moment. But I think, my hope is that throughout this time, we can do some things that really benefit people in general. But we really need to think globally on the things that we're doing. We have programs that are, not sustainable with their funding, that have no real back end as far as follow-up. We refer people to things and, they fall through the cracks. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do that are outside law enforcement, but in collaboration with law enforcement that might improve recidivism and opportunities for people that would maybe lead them away from the criminal justice system. But I think we really need to be thoughtful on how we implement things and what impacts they're going to have on communities, particularly communities of color. And one of the things that I think right now is really troubling is typically with these types of spikes in violence, chiefs would be getting calls like, hey, chief, what do you need to combat this? What kind of resources can I give you to work on this issue? And those calls aren't coming. So I think that's an issue to me that's troubling right now.
Thanks, Chuck. Okay, and I'm going to end with you, Murphy Paul. Thoughts, sir?
What I'm hearing, look, crime is a socioeconomic issue. I know law enforcement often gets blamed when we have increases, but it is a socioeconomic issue. I learned that we're not always the smartest one in the room. When you bring the community together and engage them in identifying solutions, it works. And one thing that I consistently hear when I listen to all the other chiefs and we talk about the demographics, right? Who do your victims look like, right? Who do your suspects look like? It's time we start investing in those demographics. We have to start investing in disinvested communities if we're going to get out of this current situation.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to our panel for really being honest, truthful, hard facts, but I think you've educated a lot of folks and enlightened them. I'm very grateful to all of you. Thank you very much. And now with that, I'm going to have to move on to the Department of Justice. And let's see if we can bring up the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco and Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Nice to see both of you. I'm going to refer to them in the Washington sense of the DAG and the associate. That's what they call them. The DAG means that person right under the Attorney General that kind of runs the show. And the associate has all of the criminal justice, OJP programs, all of that stuff our members are so interested in, and civil rights areas. So with that, Deputy Attorney General Monica, you just heard this discussion, or maybe you weren't able to, but I think you know this topic already. I think you know that you and the Attorney General and the President, violent crime is an issue in this country. I know you've been thinking about it. What are your thoughts? I cannot hear you.
Let's see.
Go ahead.
Are we good? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Well, first, in terms of the titles, how about Lisa and Vanita?
If I said that, they'd say I'm a sexist, so I'm not saying that.
Well, if I can call you Chuck, how about that?
You can call me Chuck, and I'll call you Lisa. We're good. We're good.
Well, first, it's great to be here with you. I wish that we weren't doing this on video, but really glad to be able to be with you. I know Vanita and I are thrilled to be able to join you, at least virtually. And look, you are so right, Chuck. This is an important conversation and a really important convening to be a part of. And so we appreciate being a part of it. We were able to hear the tail end of the last panel. And I heard the chief talk about the recruitment challenge. It's something that I've heard in prior conversations with you, Chuck, and with other law enforcement leaders. And it's something that we're acutely aware of. Look, you asked for my thoughts on the challenges we're facing in violent crime now. I think we have a shared mission. We have a joint effort that, from our perspective, is one we are looking to do all we can on, which is why I'm so pleased to be a part of this convening today. I have been looking at the numbers, the Major City Chiefs report that just came out, the double-digit increases in murder, in violent crimes like aggravated assault. It is staggering. It is sobering. And it's something that DOJ is committed to do all we can to reverse what are profoundly troubling trends and a really bad trajectory that we're on. And first and foremost, I think that means working with our partners, and that means all of you. And that's why today we are announcing that we will launch firearms trafficking strike forces to help reduce violent crime by addressing illegal gun trafficking in particularly significant gun trafficking corridors. We're going to focus in the first instance on 5 areas with these multi-jurisdictional strike forces. That's New York, Chief Commissioner Shea, rather. I know it's just on the panel. Chicago, Los Angeles, the San Francisco Bay Area, and right here in Washington, D.C. The U.S. attorneys in those areas will coordinate cross-jurisdictional strike forces with federal, state, and local law enforcement partners, focusing on where the guns are originating, where they're used in violent crime, where they're transiting, and going after the entire network. The department's going to be making additional announcements tomorrow on what we're doing and the resources, including resources that we want to make available to state and local partners to help reduce violent crime and particularly gun violence. And I think, Chuck, this announcement today and the other announcements we'll be making really builds on the violent crime reduction initiative that we announced last month, where the central focus is on supporting local communities to prevent, investigate, and prosecute violent crime. And that's why, and this violent crime reduction initiative, that's why Vanita and I are here together. We see this as a whole of department, whole of government, quite frankly, effort that needs to come at this problem. And that's why we're here together to discuss all that the Justice Department can bring to bear to support communities and to support our partners in this joint mission. The Violent Crime Reduction Initiative that we announced last month, at its core, is about community engagement. It's about building trust between law enforcement and the communities that we serve. It's about prioritizing evidence-based violent crime reduction initiatives and prevention and intervention initiatives. And I know Vanita will talk a little bit more about the resources that we have to bring to bear on that. It also emphasizes strategic and targeted enforcement efforts going after the most violent offenders. And finally, we have these 4 pillars that we're approaching this on. And the final one is on how we're going to measure the success of these efforts. And I think this is really, really important, Chuck. We're going to be measuring the success of this initiative and these efforts, not on mere statistics about cases brought or arrests made, but on actual reduction in violence, in violent incidents, and in victimization. And so that's the strategic approach we're taking. The launch of these strike forces today, going after firearms trafficking corridors, significant ones, working across with our partners. Those are some of the resources we're bringing to bear, and look forward to having more conversation with you about it.
Let me say that that's really exciting, and it sounds like DOJ gets it, and certainly after listening to these chiefs, I know that they will be grateful for all the help that they can get. Let me just ask you another question, which is sort of a larger question, because you recognize that the federal government has a significant role, but there seems to be something at the state and local level that is difficult, and that maybe Vanita can comment on this. I throw the ball to either of you, which is, how do you rebuild the trust? So much of what we're hearing from neighborhoods and quite honestly, the criminal justice system too, that has been challenged during the pandemic. You both are very professional and seasoned and know these issues. How do we get at that trust issue at the levels, and also the whole criminal justice system, which there seems to be 2 conversations. One is about over-incarceration and another is about accountability. What do you think? Vanita, what would you like to weigh in? You certainly know these issues really well.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck, and thanks to everyone for inviting Lisa and I to be a part of this. As Lisa said, we believe that we're not going to be able to really succeed in the fight against violence without the legitimacy and trust of law enforcement in the communities that they serve, that this goes hand in hand. And we heard this from chiefs on the prior panel talking about how law enforcement alone is not going to be able to solve these issues, that community engagement and interaction, violence intervention strategies that actually bring in the community and community interveners is really vital. But I don't think we can ignore the backdrop of the kind of erosion of trust in some places, the breakdown of trust in communities. And as we've talked about, we also understand that victims and witnesses in a lot of these communities, we talked about this just now, majority of people of color are from the same communities that are asking for fair policing. And so this dual mission for the Justice Department of ensuring that we can support rebuilding trust where that's eroded through any number of tactics that we have. It's through the funding streams. We have over $7 billion of funding that we're asking for in our FY22 budget to support different ranges of programming that are really operating at the local level. We need jurisdictions to apply. We need all of your chiefs that are listening to this to know that their communities are eligible for support from the federal government on innovative violence prevention efforts. There's also research and technical assistance. We have a CRITEC program that is operated by the law enforcement community to help support law enforcement and 21st century policing practices on the ground in these communities. It's through technical assistance, research. And then of course we have a much more judiciously used a tool that the Civil Rights Division operates, and the Assistant Attorney General, Kristen Clark, who I believe is is listening in on this program, you all know that that it's a tool that we have used quite judiciously, but where it is key to actually being able to figure out, are there systemic breakdowns in policing that are resulting in unconstitutional policing, and where the trust has eroded so much that that tool is necessary. And we have close to 15 consent decrees that are operating in cities around the country that I believe are really also templates for policing around the country, and can be used by chiefs that never want to see a civil rights division pattern or practice, but actually with best practices that can be deployed. But these interventions, I think, are the ways in which the Justice Department supports reform and make sure that we can help rebuild trust through these variety of tactics. All of this, we know policing is inherently a local endeavor, and the kinds of relationships, we know that if you're meeting somebody in the middle of a critical incident or a crisis, it is too late between a chief and community members. We've seen this. Chuck, you and I talked about this a lot in 2014, 2015, 2016. And I think it's why the need to ensure that there are these strong relationships, both to combat violence, to get information from victims and witnesses, and also to have the trust of the communities they serve, is absolutely critical as we seek to ensure that that departments are engaging best practices, 21st century policing practices right now.
Thank you. Let me go back to you, Lisa, if I can. There was something pretty exciting that you did the other day. You know, a lot of us are concerned about this ransomware issue. Metropolitan Police Department right here in Washington was one of the victims, I think Atlanta, other cities. But you did something pretty interesting. I should say the Justice Department, under your leadership, is you got some of that ransom back. Now, that's something that really was pretty cool, I have to say. Would you mind, I know it's still an active investigation, but what are some of the lessons that you took away from that? What are how should we think about that at the local level? Because that was pretty exciting that you could finally turn that issue around a bit.
Well, thanks, Chuck. And I'm really glad you asked about this, because as you said, the focus in the last month or so and the headlines have been about Colonial Pipeline, or, one of the largest food processing companies in the world, JBS Foods. But as we know, nobody's immune from this tactic. You mentioned MPD. Law enforcement is not immune. Whole cities have been, unfortunately, brought to their knees, at least temporarily, by some of these tactics. Last year was the worst year on record when it comes to ransomware, and the number of attacks are up. The amounts being paid have increased, and the impact is increasing in severity, as we saw with Colonial Pipeline just in the last month or so. The FBI is investigating over 100 variants, different types of ransomware, malware, and this ransomware as a service is a significant threat. And what do I mean by that? That's where the malware developers are literally renting out this technique and this tool to criminal groups, criminal actors, their affiliates, and then taking a share of the proceeds, right? That's your classic criminal scheme when it comes to the use of this tool. And so what we did, as you referenced, Chuck, in the last couple of weeks, is with the help and the cooperation of Colonial Pipeline, and this was critical, we were able to follow the money. Everyone on this call is in law enforcement. You understand the potency and the importance of that concept. It's true in the physical world, and it's true in the cyber world. And what we did is we followed the money, the use of Bitcoin to pay the ransom here, and we're able to seize it and recover the majority of it back for the victim. And so the lesson here is early breach notification, and critically, the cooperation of the victim, the cooperation of the company to help us be able to go follow that money. Now, what I said in that press conference, Chuck, is we won't be able to do this every time, but we certainly wouldn't be able to do it without the cooperation and early notification and help of the victim. And it's so critically important to be able to both deny the bad guys the fruits of their scheme, and importantly, to be able to prevent victims in the future. So the message, whether it's to a corporate CEO, to a commissioner of a police department, a mayor of a city, it's invest resources now, pay attention now, plan now, because no one's immune from these attacks.
Do you see this as mostly a federal responsibility, or are there ways that state and local law enforcement can support you? How should we work with the federal government on this issue?
So it's like everything that we do, Chuck, in protecting public safety in every form, it's got to be a combined effort. So working with federal, state, and local law enforcement together, and working with the private sector and the victims in these cases, I think state and local partners can be critical in this effort. You may be the first to hear of a particular victim in your community. They may reach out to you, and you can be a critical partner in that early notification. The FBI, of course, has the lead in investigating these attacks, and they rely, as in everything, on their partnerships with state and local law enforcement to help trace these and to help follow up with the victims.
Okay, back to Vanita Gupta, if I can. Two questions for you. I think you touched on both of them, but if you want to elaborate. One is you oversee all Office of Justice programs, and maybe some thoughts about sort of your big picture ideas for that. And the second is you also oversee the Civil Rights Division. Are there ways that departments can learn from the consent decrees that have already been out there, so that a department says, you know what do I need to do to prevent a consent decree? So I know those are two gigantic topics, but maybe if you can touch on both, that would be terrific.
Sure. The Office of Justice Programs is one of the grant-making components at the Justice Department. There's also the COPS Office, the Office of Violence Against Women, and those include the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which many of the chiefs are quite well familiar with, Burn JAG grant money, and Office of Victims of Crime. And the goal is that we are speaking as one department. These funding streams don't exist just unto themselves, but they are tied in with the violence prevention and intervention strategies that Lisa is talking about, and that a new strategy that was launched also last month. There's grant making and funding to help support and advance those strategies throughout the country. And that's how we think of these issues. And so when we think about funding, we're thinking that the Office of Justice Programs is looking also, and I think this came up as a theme in prior conversations, Chuck, that it isn't just about putting all these problems at the feet of police, that we understand that a lot of these questions about community police trust also are tied in with broader trends and thinking around criminal justice, the criminal justice system, and criminal justice reform. They're tied in with access to community-based substance use treatment facilities and mental health treatment facilities. And one of the things that I think is unique about some of the dynamics, or maybe changed about today versus maybe after Ferguson, is that there's a recognition in communities that law enforcement in many ways has been holding the bag on so many of social problems. We put all of these problems at the feet of law enforcement, while not kind of providing the same kinds of investments and focus on community-based interventions that actually could relieve some of these burdens from law enforcement. And it's something that I've heard, and Lisa and I both have heard a lot from sheriffs, from chiefs, from police officers, that actually I think really bring advocates and activists together in communities, and a desire to have a more holistic set of solutions that law enforcement alone can't deal with. It's going to have to involve county commissioners, state lawmakers, the Justice Department, Congress, and taking this broader approach is something that isn't easy because we all operate within our own bureaucracies, but actually kind of trying to bring that thinking and having funding through the Office of Justice Programs that can support smart, evidence-based criminal justice reform, 21st century policing practices. I still think there's a lot that we still don't understand about what works in policing and police reform. And I know that Lisa and the Attorney General and I and other department leaders want to make sure that when we speak about reforms that and I've been hearing this from a lot of chiefs and as well, that we want to be able to advocate and scale up the kinds of programs that we know are working, that both create safety, build trust, and provide communities with the kinds of tools that we need to provide more holistic solutions to both prevent violence and ensure community police trust. And so that's the kind of, the Office of Justice Programs is providing a broad range of funding on these issues. We also do a lot of work to support victims of crime. We know re-victimization can help fuel rates of violence in low-income communities. And so we want to bring this holistic approach through our funding. The COPS Office, as you well know, supports law enforcement innovation, research, hiring as well. And we've been looking at other ways and interventions, like potentially looking again at collaborative reform and critical response, so that we can do quick studies after there are incidents and learn from it and share it with the field. And so there'll be more coming from that. But that's the ethos that we're bringing to this work. And we welcome ideas always. We are always, interested in hearing from all of you, learning from all of you, learning about what you're experiencing, which is why I think these town halls are so important. On the second question, Chuck, on the Civil Rights Division consent decrees, in a lot of ways, these consent decrees, they are all different because we recognize how local policing really is. But they do provide a lot of ideas and kind of resources for other police departments to take a look at. The Civil Rights Division actually put together an interactive website that allows you to look at all of their consent decrees, the kinds of model policies that have been advanced on use of force, discriminatory policing, stop searches and arrests, looking at data, looking at officer wellness and safety programs and how those have been instituted in communities through the consent decrees. And I think that's a really important kind of portal for chiefs to look at. It's supposed to make it digestible and easy to access. We are also just put out a solicitation through the Office of Justice Programs on a knowledge lab that is actually going to create a one-stop shop deriving from the expertise in the Civil Rights Division, COPS. I'm sure it's going to be pulling from PERF research, from all of the components in the Justice Department that do work on state and local policing, to become a one-stop shop that aggregates the knowledge and best practices and can provide direct technical assistance to folks in the field. And we want to make sure we have a spectrum of interventions to support on these issues, not, from the Civil Rights Division's pattern practice investigations, which is at one end of the spectrum, but to the technical assistance that we can provide and the funding support that we can provide to implement programs that can really take a more holistic approach. And so that's what we're trying to do here at the Justice Department, and always seeking to understand more from the field about how we can better serve everyone's needs.
Thank you both very much. I know really how busy you are. Thank you for carving out this time. It means a lot to us. We appreciate it. Thank you for what you do. And I know you got to get over to the White House or somewhere else more important than here. Thank you both very much. We appreciate you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for having us.
Okay, we're going to our next panel. We're slightly behind, but we're going to catch up. We're going to talk about the media. We got three guests, Tom Jackman from the Washington Post, Tammy Abdullah from USA Today, and Pierre Thomas from ABC News. Now, I don't really know how to have this conversation, so I'm just going to get into it. I'm going to start with Tom Jackman first. Tom, I don't know if you heard the conversation beforehand with violent crime and so forth. You know this issue. You've been with the Washington Post since 1998. You covered the DC sniper trials, Virginia Tech mass shootings, and most recently, the shooting Bijan Gazer several years ago. You've been on that story. What in your time, Tom Jackman, how has the press evolved in your experience? And understand, the people listening in today, they're police chiefs, sheriffs, academics, and so forth. So part of what I'm trying to do is get your advice as to how you see that role And how do police put their best foot forward when they're engaging with a tough reporter like you? So take a few minutes and talk about, when does it work? When does it not work? Tom Jackman.
That's a hard one because you deal with a lot of different reporters when you're a police department. You deal with the daily beat reporters, and then you deal with these guys who parachute in nationally. And the local daily beat reporters tend to have a better understanding of how the local police work, and so and also know where better to get information. I mean, once upon a time, back in the 1980s, I used to go and plop down in the middle of the homicide unit in Kansas City and talk about the Chiefs game last night or the homicide at 36th and Prospect. And, I really got a great insight into how police do their jobs and a great appreciation of it. I wrote a book with a homicide sergeant there. So the police figured out that wasn't a good idea to let reporters roam around the Crimes Against Persons unit, and that doesn't happen anymore. But what police can do is get their positive stories out. I'm not going to deny that the media, particularly in the last few years, have an appetite for stories that don't make the police look great. But there are a lot of stories that do make the police look great that we often don't hear about. And I'm talking about solving cases, saving lives, crime rates going down, things that police have typically been hesitant to take any credit for. Like there's an annual Valor Awards ceremony here in Northern Virginia where cops get awards for amazing things they do, and there's 15 of them all at once that we'd never heard of. When the feds put out press releases about cases that they are working, they list their assistant U.S. attorneys who, are working the case. But you never see that from police departments, that this case was solved by Detective Jones. And I think that police can be more proactive. And I'm not talking about doing the, Christmas with a cop or sort of the standard PR stories. I'm talking about stories that show how the police are making a difference. And if not taking credit for crime decreases, at least putting out there that crime is going down when it does, and looking for angles and reaching out to reporters to say, you guys are always looking for the bad side of us. Here's the good side. And I don't think that police do that well at all. And they need to be much better at presenting the things they do well. And I think that does build trust in the community and granting
Tom,
some more access.
Tom, can you give me...
Stop me from yapping.
Can you give me some examples of stories you'd like to write about that, might give our audience some ideas? In other words, you just started off with homicide, like sort of being embedded with a homicide unit and so forth. I'm interested. If you had a magic wand and you wanted to write a story that perhaps even the police might want to be told, what kind of stories would they be?
How they solve crimes, is fascinating to people. How cops from day 1 to day 180 make our community safer by solving crimes, A, and B, by letting us see how community policing works firsthand, patrolling works firsthand, to, build that trust, to show how the police are the good guys. The police are the good guys. That's been forgotten. These are the police that are out there volunteering to protect us. And the media have lost track of that. And we need to, but we don't have access to it a lot of times. What we have access to is people complaining about the police. And there are a lot of people who support the police. And so I think there are positive stories that the media will write when we have access to actual officers and detectives who are doing, the line work that really does create the trust that, say, that Chief Shields talked about earlier that she wanted to see in Louisville.
Do you think that it's harder writing today than it was when you wrote 20 years ago? What's different today? what is, how do you fit into the national narrative? I mean, does that make it different? Do your editors expect different things from you?
Well, there's a lot less emphasis on local and much more emphasis on stories that can go, I hate to say this word, but viral. That there's a demand for stories that can get bigger audiences. And so we didn't have that potential pre-internet. And with the internet, we now have the potential, as amplified by our owner, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, in the case of the Washington Post, to create stories that will attract much more viewers. And so to write about one police department or one thing is often not as well looked upon by our editors as stories that are broader, that can show how the police do these things on a national basis. So that's what's changed, is that our editors are not as focused on the daily local news. They want something that can go worldwide, that can go viral. And I think that's true in a lot of outlets, that focusing on one incident or one department is not as desirable as a story that can go national.
Okay, and then you'll stand by. I'm going to bring all three of you up together here in a second. I want to introduce Tammy Abdullah. She covers criminal justice for USA Today, and she has been involved in cybersecurity, terrorism for the Associated Press and the LA Times. Tammy, how are you?
Chuck, I'm doing all right.
Yep.
Glad to be here.
Okay. All right. So you tend to write what I would call long form stories, big research stories, and so forth. You know, but you've also been with the LA Times, you've been with AP, you're a professional journalist. How have things changed from your perspective in terms of dealing with the police? Again, our audience is trying to learn from you all. How can they understand what your needs are? Tell me about how you view the world.
Well, personally, I feel like I covered law enforcement for a very long time. And I'm based in Los Angeles, and I had the good fortune to really kind of get to know a lot of different cops on their beats, and shadow some cold case detectives. I've had a lot of really, I think, valuable experiences. Now, I think, especially today, you have a lot of people on these beats that that might not have built up experience covering law enforcement. They might approach it from different angles. And I do think that that's created a little bit more of maybe an adversarial relationship that I think would be helpful to really inform the public about policing and policing today. There are so many tense issues at play. My beat specifically right now is very focused on looking at inequities and disparities in the criminal justice system very broadly. And when I tell people that, I tell them, inequities, obviously race or gender, but also, left-handers versus right-handers. It doesn't need to be what everyone, it doesn't need to be the hot topics of the day, although those are important. And most of the officers who I know and speak with are like, yeah, great. That's important, right? But when you have people who come in who aren't familiar with policing, who might be approaching it from other perspectives, community perspectives, I think it's a little harder for officers to kind of wrap their minds around what people are doing, because maybe they aren't familiar with the police line, they aren't familiar with how policing works. And I just think that a lot of the coverage over the last 5-6 years has made the relationship a lot less open than maybe it was 10-15 years ago. And not to say that, reporters and cops, I would say that there's always been a little bit of a tension. Reporters want everything, and the cops feel like they want to protect their investigation or their work. And I mean, that tension is what builds an informed, ultimately, stories that can inform the public.
It sounds like a lot of what you talked about at the beginning is what I heard Tom Jackman say in terms of like building relationships. But now it feels different. I mean, for some reason, the narrative makes the police feel a little more protective, defensive. You know, like they want to get their story out, and sometimes mistakes happen. But isn't so much about when you maybe covered from Los Angeles, building relationships? Aren't there ways that reporters build relationships that make a difference? That you know, sort of John Miller likes to talk about building relationships during non-stress times. How much of your job is predicated on, you know, kind of trust, if you will? You know, like being able to talk to someone who'll give you the whole story, and because they trust you. How does the press build those kind of, you know, trusting relationships? Doesn't mean that you're not going to do your job. Doesn't mean the police aren't going to do their job. But somehow working cops and working press have a job to do. How do you build that relationship?
I mean, so two things, and I do want to add that, you know, it is understandable that there's a little more of a protective feeling around cops these days because they're under a microscope. There's so many more cameras out filming everything they're doing. If someone had a camera on me 24/7, you know, I'd get a little more defensive, frankly, too, about my activities, right? But in terms of building trust, obviously that is incredibly crucial. And I think obviously it goes both ways. You know, the cops need to feel like they can trust the reporter need to feel like they can trust the cop, whoever they're speaking with. And I think that begins with open communication, frankly. And what maybe a lot of police don't realize is that reporters and police officers are often very similar. They're in high stress situations, high stress jobs. Obviously, reporters aren't dealing with weapons and don't have that same training, but you know they're both running toward the danger by and large. And so you know, I think that when people can realize that the other is not that different from themselves, you know, they're able to maybe have a little more of an open and honest conversation. That is crucial, and being transparent, at least for me. You know, when I get to know folks and I talk with them about issues in policing, I want to feel like they're being truthful and they're actually, you know, honestly sharing what is happening with context. I mean, I think that most people who deal with reporters realize that when you put up a wall, you're only encouraging that reporter to jump over it or try to dig under it. What's really important is having sort of that two-way communication and explaining what is going on, why it's going on, and you know, if something, you know, is happening that can't be reported. I mean, frankly, it's always better to explain why than to encourage the reporter to try to push back. And on the other side, the reporter side, I think that, you know, every reporter functions differently. I'll say that for myself. I like to function transparently. I like to, you know, ask questions that I really want to know the answers to. And when I write a story, I don't expect anyone to pick up the paper the next day and be like, "Oh shit, what is it?" Pardon my language, but "Oh shit, what is that?" I never talked about that story. I mean, you know, if it's not a great story, I'm going to tell you, this is not a great story. I mean, you don't look great in this story. Please explain to me, you know, why you're doing this or that. And I just think that when you're honest with people, you gain their respect. You show that you respect them, and ultimately, it helps the public understand policing better.
Okay. Thank you, Tammy. And stand by, we're going to bring you back here. Let me introduce Pierre Thomas. Pierre Thomas, let's get Pierre on. Okay. Hello, Pierre. How are you, sir?
Hey there, Chuck.
Okay. Pierre
Thank you for
Thomas
having
is
me.
well, thank you for being here, sir. Pierre Thomas is a senior justice correspondent for ABC News, where he has worked since 2000. He previously worked for the Washington Post in 1987 to 1997, and from CNN from 1997 to 2000. So, Pierre, you have the benefit of, knowing what it's like to be a print reporter and knowing what it's like to be a national correspondent. Many of us here in Washington, remember you when you worked for the Washington Post and covering stories. My good friend Charlie Dean says you're about one of the best reporters in the business. And, those of us who know Charlie Dean, that's about the nicest compliment you can get. What has it been like for you over your career as a Washington Post reporter and then now as a national correspondent? How are those jobs different? What did you learn? What did you pick up along the way about how you do your job? You're a tough reporter, but yet you're respected. Tell us how you've done it and what works for you. What has worked for you?
Again, pleased to be with you and your colleagues. One of the things that I think Tammy said that I would echo is being transparent about what it is that you're working on and the relationships you develop in non-crisis situations are critical to when you are dealing with crisis situations, and to be as honest and forthcoming as you can be about, here's the story I'm working on. And here's what I'm asking of you in terms of helping me unravel the story, understand the story. There's just no substitute for appearing and actually being honest and straightforward in what you're working on. I just think that is really critical to being a reporter, both in the print or on television, because at the end of the day, no one really has to talk to you. It's not, there's no guarantee that anyone has to speak with you. So I believe that part of what you need to do is do your work in a professional, thoughtful way and let your reputation be the guide for people in terms of how they choose to deal with you. There are some differences, obviously, between the print and the television side. The television side, I have to be a part of the story in terms of narrating the story, describing the story in a more personal way, quite frankly, than I was used to when I was at the Washington Post, where I could go out, report the story, write the story, maybe walking into a McDonald's and see someone reading my story, and that was about as much connection I would have with the reader. Whereas, being on television where millions of people are watching your work, I can't tell you how many times people come up to me and talk to me as if they know me. And I guess in part in their mind they do, because I've been coming into their homes so many years now, which is strange to say. I've been on television longer than I was a print reporter. But a lot of the fundamentals I learned in terms of covering stories, how to cover stories, how to treat people, I learned back then, and I apply those daily. But these are complicated times. They're interesting times, and if you're honest with people, I find that's the greatest tool for being someone people are willing to deal with.
What do you see as how have things changed today? It feels like, at least from when I talk to police chiefs, they have a sense of being defensive. They're worried that the press that's calling them, yet my sense is if they know the reporter, if they, even a reporter that they know with bad news is better than a reporter that they don't know, right? And how have things changed? Go ahead.
I think the interpersonal relationships and the work you put in before there's a crisis matters. And be it covering the FBI, be it covering Prince William County, the police department, that's when I got to know Charlie Dean. Showing up, being consistent, all those things matter. I think the big difference now is that there's so much in terms of events that are happening and unfolding so quickly. And this word viral, stories can happen and be viral instantaneously. Now, maybe I'm old fashioned, but I'm using the same standards that I learned at the Washington Post for anything I'm publishing today. For example, I'm not tweeting anything unless I've used the same standards that I use for reporting a story in the Washington Post or, on ABC News. That's just, it just helps me in being consistent in terms of what my expectations are for how I do my work. I think police departments, I have found to be, all about interpersonal relationships, all about the reputation that you have. Look, at the end of the day, when something horrific happens like George Floyd, that story is going to be covered. And the idea is that you have to cover that story thoughtfully and in the nuanced way that you need to cover it. But we just had a story recently about a police officer who saved a child's life on an overpass. That's an equally compelling story that the media, I think, was happy to do and to cover. We had the insurrection, where we saw police officers against incredible odds and numbers stand up and do their jobs, and in that moment protect democracy, if you will. And I covered that story repeatedly over and over again, interviewed some of the officers involved, gave them a chance to share their story. And I think the dialogue that you're talking about, Chuck, is really important for police to feel comfortable and know enough reporters to pick up the phone and call them and say, have you thought about this part of this story? Here's a story that might be interesting for you to do. I think those all things are critical, especially where the country is so divided. I just think that where we can give people facts and information that they can look at and then draw their own conclusions about is really critical.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. Let's bring everybody onto the screen here. We've got about 10 minutes or so left. We're going to bring everybody up here. Okay, hold on. There we go. Okay, we've got everybody here. And Tom, you've got a question?
We do. We had a question from the audience. They heard the panel say that they want to cover positive stories, but as Tom Jackman from the Washington Post says, editors may not be interested in those local stories, may be interested in those more national stories. So thoughts on how do they get these positive stories out?
Okay, let's let Tom Jackman answer that question, and then if either of our other folks want to respond, just go like this, and I'll call on you. Okay, go ahead, Tom.
I think there still is an appetite for those stories. They're not breaking news stories, but they can be done. And I think there's a perception in policing that we're not interested in those stories. And I think that's not true, but positive stories perhaps need to come when George Floyd isn't happening, when January 6th isn't happening, when Lafayette Square isn't happening, when we're focusing on the hot topic of the moment. One way to do it would be to play off of the hot topic of the moment by saying, the reason that we know so much about this topic is because we trained for this, or we have the technology for this, not to give away secrets, but to let the public see into how the police do their jobs. That is genuinely interesting to people. And they can't just be puff pieces about what a nice guy Chuck Wexler is or Tom Wilson. They have to be sort of new and fascinating. And I know that police departments have those stories, and they are going to take a back seat to the hot topic of the moment. But if they're part of that hot topic, they can then ride in with it. Or they can come in when there's a down moment, like maybe now. But I think it is possible to get to the right reporter who can make the right pitch to say, this is an important story, we should do it, even though it doesn't make the police look bad. There are stories that can be done that don't make the police look bad.
What I hear you saying, and then I'm going to call Tammy and then Pierre. One of the things, reporters will say is, give me as much information. I got to pitch this to my editor. So what you're asking for is, give me the information that will make this a compelling case. Don't just tell me that, oh, this is a great story because you think it's a great story. What is it about it, right? And just quick follow-up with Tom and then Tammy and Pierre. You got to pitch it. You don't have discretion to write maybe you do. I don't know how the Washington Post works, but isn't it you're like a lawyer who's going to make an appeal to a higher up, right?
That's exactly correct. I'm the low man on the totem pole here at the Washington Post. There are many layers. I'm at the bottom layer. So I do have to convince editors that this is interesting. It's new. It's going to get eyeballs. It's going to get readers, and those are the considerations that editors take when they hear these pitches. And they're getting pitched by lots of reporters, not just loudmouth Tom Jackman. There's all sorts of reporters making pitches, and it's a competition. And even once we get the stories written, there's another competition to get them published and to get them on the front page or to get them on the homepage of the website. We're constantly competing within our own organizations to get stories done and get them published prominently. So that's part of the considerations for me at all times.
All right, Tammy and then Pierre.
I want to kind of go back to the idea of transparency, because when you are transparent with a reporter and you're giving them, the everything, the good and the bad, I mean, you get the good out as well as the bad. If you're only giving them the good, the positive, and you're unwilling to even discuss, an incident that occurs that, might have been problematic, it takes away from the credibility of that positive story. However, if you are open with the reporters and you have that relationship of trust, where you are talking with them when something doesn't go right, and when things are going better, you're also talking with them. I do think it's a lot easier to get those stories written, to pitch those stories. And I do think, as Tom said, that it's not necessarily the PR play. In my mind, I'm not even necessarily thinking like positive versus negative story. I'm thinking, here's a story about how police do their job. Here's a story about how they solve this case. Here's a story about what happened this day. And, fine, it makes police look great. Good. I mean, if it, that's not my focus as a reporter personally, but my focus is on informing the public about incidents that they should know about, whether good or bad. Now, frankly, a lot of these quote unquote bad incidents are things that the public has to know about, and happen, on video or go viral. And so, those are in your face. Now, the incidents that the public should know about that involve, good detective work, good police work, they're not in your face always, and police aren't putting them out there in a way that reporters can actually engage with the material. We're talking about bringing a reporter in when you have a case that you're wrapping up and letting them know as you're wrapping it up so that they can work on this story along with you and get it written up. We're talking about those types of stories, unless, rescuing a cat from a tree by the fire department, or, there are a lot of positive stories that occur in policing that could easily be written about as just another day in policing.
Okay, Pierre.
Yeah, I would say, look, we're about storytelling, and we want the most interesting stories to tell, be they positive or negative. And I agree with Tom and Tammy in this regard. Is when you're selling the story, you're selling a story that you think people will be interested in. And a lot of what the police ends up doing is just interesting. Like if there's a mass shooting, how the police responded, and often the heroism that's shown in running toward shots, it's a part of the story. And there are often cases where you see some departments embrace the fact that, look, something horrible just happened, but I just had my people show exemplary valor and go in and save lives. And there's some departments that do it really well, where they just brief and tell people exactly what happened, and that becomes a part of the narrative and helps people understand. Look at what kind of people we have in this department that were willing to do that for you. Now, the reporter, we're not thinking about that, but we want the full story. So if you have the chief come out and brief and say, look, 5 of my officers went into that building and shots were still ringing out, and they pulled 5 people out. Guess what? We want to tell that story. We want to give the layered sequence of events to describe that story. There's a lot of, for example, what the FBI does when they're solving a terrorism case, when there's a cyber case that they're involved in. You know, a lot of the work is that. And I just think that departments have to, if they sort of start from the standpoint, I want the people to know as much about what we do as possible and develop relationships with reporters that they trust. That's a start. And at the end of the day, you judge us by the work that we do. And I use that as a tool to this day, that, you know, hopefully people see my name and know if they're getting a call from me, okay, it's going to be a fair story. It's going to be objective. It may be tough, but, you know, I'm going to know what he's up to, how he's proceeding with the story. And when, as Tammy said, when it's published, there won't be any great surprise by what you see published, because it should be very similar to what I talked to you about, what I described, and what I was reporting as the story was unfolding.
You know, my enemy here is time, because I'd like to, maybe we'll go over a few minutes. Who cares? We go over, because I want to bring Mike Harrison on here again from Baltimore. But, you know, I know what my people are thinking. They're looking at the 3 of you and they're thinking, well, Chuck, those are professionals. They've been around, you know. But these new young reporters, you know, they want to be the next Woodward and Bernstein at my expense, and they don't necessarily have that pre-existing relationship, and that worries them, because, you know, it's sort of an asymmetric relationship. The relationships you 3 have built over the years is based on trust, and you can get that story. But, you know, I know there's some people out there thinking, what do you do when you have a reporter that has an agenda? Like, they feel like they know the story, and they're calling to, you know, to either get more information or basically, you know, it's just a difficult relationship. I know we only have a couple of minutes. Is there any ideas you have for that reporter that just maybe is a little more challenging? This looks like Hollywood Squares, and no one wants to answer that one. Okay, real quickly, Tammy, go ahead.
I'll be Charlie Weaver on that. I mean, you could go to the, you know, the competition. Go to a reporter that is not that person, and get it out that way. I mean, it's tough. There are absolutely reporters that, like you just described, and we would say there are bad apples in every profession. You may have heard that term before. So, but there are ways around those people. There are other people that want the story that person has. Give it to that person.
Let me do this in the interest of time. We have another question, and then I got to get Mike Harrison on here before the end to just say a few words here. What's the question, Tom?
Chuck, the question was similar to what you asked, but it was, has their relationship with police changed since the murder of George Floyd?
That's a tough one.
I'll take that one.
Go ahead, Pierre.
I would say yes and no. Look, cameras being ubiquitous and, you know, having more of those stories out there than there used to be is sort of part of what's baked into the cake now. But the same rules apply, where your video comes out, you ask questions about it, you see how the case is going to unfold, and then you do the story. The interesting thing, if you look at how the George Floyd story was covered, I think if you look at the way that trial was covered. I think people did a very good job, by and large, the media, of covering here's what the prosecution says, here's what the defense said. And then the video itself spoke volumes about what did or didn't happen. And this is much I would share as well. Every police officer that I spoke to off camera or on background about that case thought it did more to set back policing than any case they could think of, because that's not the image that they want of police. I mean, one of the things, again, he's been convicted. I guess we have the sentencing coming up soon, but no police officer I talked to said the casual look on the officer's face in the way that George Floyd was killed was a good thing. And whether it was a crime or not, many of the police officers I've interviewed in past years talk about that the best officers seek to de-escalate situations. That's a common denominator, and that they can look at those scenarios and make judgments. And then the last thing I would say about the reporters, you have the standard of reporters doing it the right way. And if you know what that standard is, it will be immediately apparent to you when people are not comporting themselves in the best or most professional way. And so I don't typically give advice to sources in that regard, but that much I can say, that look, the way Tammy or Tom is dealing with you is what your expectations should be. And then when you see it being different, that might be a red flag of, okay, let me pay attention here, and again, still be transparent, still be honest, but recognize what you may or may not be dealing with.
Tammy and Tom, I'm going to both give you 1 minute because we're over here, and then I'm going to bring Mike Harrison on. Tom, get ready to bring Mike Harrison from Baltimore on. Tammy, I apologize, but we're over, so that's why I have to give you a time limit. Tammy, 1 minute. Tom Jackman, 1 minute.
All right. Well, I mean, I just want to say that for the reporter with an agenda, obviously what Tom and Pierre suggest, I think, you do want to gauge their behavior. Maybe you don't want to deal with them. Maybe you want to go to coffee with them and figure out, what are they? Who are they? Maybe they just don't know anything about policing, and maybe it's worth a conversation to figure that out, and for them to learn from you as well. And maybe that can change the relationship. So I wouldn't just write someone off. I would invest a little bit of time if that person's going to be in that role and you think they have an agenda, they're going to be covering policing, to figure out who they are. And that's pretty much what I'd say. I think that at the core of this, of all of this, there's relationships, and I think that treating each other with respect ultimately is the best way to go about it.
Tom Jackman, I'm going to give you the last word.
I think that police can make the argument to journalists that there is an audience for the stories that are positive about them. There are all sorts of crime shows which show police doing good work. There are all these groups that support police neighborhood advisory councils, chief advisory councils. There are a lot of people who do want to hear about the good things that police do. And if reporters are fair, they should be committed to doing those stories as well as the negative stories. And that's another argument they can make. And the police public information offices know the reporters they deal with, and they know who they can pitch these stories to, because in virtually every city I talk to now, they have very competent and aware public information operations that know how to get these stories out.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all. Thank you very much. I think it was an opportunity for people to rethink maybe what's going on in their own communities. You're all the best. Thank you very much. We're going to switch now. I'm going to let Mike Harrison from Baltimore. Hello, Commissioner. You've been listening to this conversation. I kind of wanted to give you the last word here. Just any observations you want to make listening to this whole day?
Well, great.
You're on mute. Oh, there you go. Sorry. You're good. You're good. You're good. Yes, sir.
No, this
Sorry.
was great. It was very timely, very relevant. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists from the different groups, the police chiefs that brought their expertise and their observations. Then we had the Deputy and Associate Attorney General talking about reform initiatives and support from DOJ, and then the leaders from our media outlets. Look, we talked about three things: violent crime, reform, and then the anti-police sentiment versus the good work that's being done on the streets of our cities. All of which is viewed through the lens of mainstream and social media. And all three of these points meet at an intersection, Chuck, and they meet all the time at the same time. Violent crime doesn't slow down for reform. Reform doesn't slow down for violent crime to go down. And certainly the media doesn't stop or slow down to wait for us to solve violent crime and to reform our agencies. They happen all the time at the same time. So I think this was great, certainly valuable for me. And I want to thank everybody who participated in today's town hall. And then lastly, thank you, Chuck, for facilitating the conversation and searching for solutions for the problems we all face, once again, all the time, at the same time, everywhere.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, and thank you for your leadership in Baltimore. Baltimore is changing, and you're a big part of that. Thank you, sir, for your leadership. And to Central Square, our sponsor, nice folks, one phone call. They said, yep, Chuck, whatever you need. Thank you, Central Square, for what you do. And to all of you out there, thank you for listening, for all of our speakers today. We appreciate it. Thank you again, everybody. Have a good day.